He had always loved cars. It wasn't just a hobby. It was something that gave him peace and a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. Over the years, he had quietly collected several vehicles, each one unique, each one with a story. Some were classic cars that gleamed under the sunlight, their paint polished to perfection. Others were modern luxury cars with engines that purred like a contented animal. He never flaunted them. To most people, they were just cars sitting in a private garage and storage spaces. They didn't know that he owned every single one, secretly and legally. The quiet routine he had built around his cars was about to be disrupted. It started subtly, almost unnoticeable at first. A note left on one of the cars warning that it had been reported as abandoned. Another message arrived, claiming someone had filed a complaint about the way the vehicles were stored. He read each note calmly, placing them aside without reacting. He knew people liked to make assumptions. He had learned long ago that patience often revealed more than immediate action ever could. Then the visits started. A few people came around, looking as if they had a right to speak, asking questions about the cars, making suggestions about selling or moving them. Their tone was sharp, as if they had authority that didn't actually exist. He listened quietly, nodding and giving small answers that said nothing. Deep down, he wasn't worried. He had dealt with people who liked to overstep their bounds before. This was different, though. There was a sense of urgency in their eyes, as if they believed time was on their side. He started noticing more people around the storage areas where the cars were parked. Neighbors, strangers, even those who seemed to know him but acted distant, wandered by to peek at the cars. Rumors began to spread. "He doesn't really own those," someone whispered. "I heard they're going to be auctioned soon." Each new story was more exaggerated than the last. It would have been easy to react angrily, to correct the misconceptions. Instead, he stayed calm. He had a plan, though no one could guess it yet. The man who had lived quietly among his cars found himself under a sort of invisible pressure. Notices came more frequently now, some official-looking, others just letters with vague threats. The people who had been talking to him before became bolder. They visited more often, asking more pointed questions, hinting at legal action, even implying he was negligent. He walked among the cars each day, checking the tires, the engines, the paint, and the interiors, never letting the growing tension show on his face. He knew that showing fear or frustration would only encourage them. Despite the pressure, he remained observant. Every visit, every note, every whispered rumor was documented. He kept a careful record, knowing that one day the truth would matter more than the assumptions being made now. He began to notice patterns in their behavior. The people who came around were not random. They were connected in ways he could see if he paid attention. Their visits were timed, their comments rehearsed, their eyes always scanning for weaknesses. It was as if they thought he was an easy target, someone who could be intimidated into giving up what was his. Friends who knew about his cars began to offer advice, suggesting he fight back immediately. Confront the intruders or go to the authorities. He smiled politely and thanked them, but he didn't follow their advice. He had learned the hard way that a calm mind could outmaneuver the loudest voices. Confrontation now would only alert them to his reaction, and that was not something he wanted. Instead, he increased his observation, quietly enhancing security measures and making sure every detail was recorded. The first real test came when one of the individuals, a man who had been especially persistent, tried to move one of the vehicles. He claimed it was abandoned and had to be towed. The man calmly explained that the car was legally his, presenting registration and proof of insurance. The other man scoffed, insisting that ownership documents were meaningless and that the car would be removed anyway. The situation became tense, and a small crowd began to gather, curious about the confrontation. The quiet man stayed composed, never raising his voice, only letting the documentation speak for him. Eventually, the man left, grumbling but unable to act. Despite winning that small battle, the tension didn't ease. More people became aware of the cars, and the whispers of auction and seizure grew louder. It was clear that his secret ownership, which had kept his collection safe and unnoticed for so long, was now being challenged. He realized that patience and strategy were more important than ever. Each day, he walked around his collection. Not with fear, but with careful calculation, knowing that the next move would need precision. What he didn't expect, though, was the psychological toll it began to take. People began to question him, not directly, but in subtle ways that made him feel the judgment and assumptions of those around him. Even neighbors he thought he could trust started giving curious looks, whispering to each other as he passed. It was unsettling, but he refused to let it show. He had faced challenges before, and he knew that true strength was silent, not loud. Late one evening, after a particularly long day of observing and documenting, he sat in his garage among the cars. The lights reflected off polished metal and shiny paint, casting long shadows that seemed to dance quietly. He thought about the situation carefully, realizing that the upcoming weeks could determine the safety of his collection. He also realized that he had underestimated the persistence of those who thought they could intimidate him. This reflection was not despair, but strategy. He began planning carefully. Considering every potential move from those who sought to challenge him, he started contacting a few discreet professionals, lawyers, security advisors, and people familiar with property rights and legal processes. All communications were private, with no hint of urgency. He wanted to be prepared, not reactive. Every precaution, every step he took, was designed to keep the advantage in his hands. Even while appearing calm to the outside world, he was quietly setting a stage where the truth would emerge decisively. Meanwhile, his daily routine continued as if nothing had changed. He washed the cars, tuned the engines, polished the interiors, and made small adjustments that kept the vehicles in pristine condition. For him, this wasn't just maintenance, it was a form of meditation. Each movement, each careful touch, reminded him why he had worked so hard to build this collection in the first place. He focused on the cars, not the distractions. Using his passion to maintain his composure, the people who were trying to take the cars grew frustrated as well. They could see that their threats and notices had no immediate effect. Their impatience became visible. Their confidence waned slightly, though they didn't realize why. He noticed these changes, quietly noting them down. Every interaction, every reaction, was a piece of a larger puzzle he was assembling. His strategy was not just about protecting the cars, it was about ensuring that when the moment came, the truth would be undeniable. It was during this time that an unexpected ally appeared, a former colleague who knew of his secret collection but had remained silent. They offered advice, contacts, and support, all discreetly. Their guidance reinforced his plan, helping him see angles he had not considered. With this quiet reinforcement, he felt a renewed sense of control. The pressure was still there, but he was no longer alone in navigating it. As the days turned into weeks, tension grew in the neighborhood. Rumors of impending auctions and legal battles swirled. The quiet man continued his routine, never showing anxiety or anger, letting the whispers and assumptions bounce off him. Every day he maintained focus, carefully observing, documenting, and refining his plan. It was clear that his adversaries were making mistakes born of impatience and overconfidence. They underestimated his ability to stay calm and the depth of his preparation. Then, one morning, a small confrontation occurred that would mark a turning point. One of the persistent individuals approached a car, claiming it needed immediate removal. The man calmly presented documentation again, explaining that the vehicle was legally registered under his name and properly maintained. The other person's voice rose in frustration, insisting that procedures had to be followed. But this time, there were witnesses who could see the man's calm and professional approach. Slowly, the aggressor realized that their intimidation tactics were not working, that they had underestimated the quiet man's preparedness. By the end of the first part of this story, it was clear that the man's secret ownership was not a secret to him, it was a fortress. He remained composed, observant, and quietly strategic, aware of the growing tension around his collection. The people who sought to take what was his were unaware that they were being watched, recorded, and outmaneuvered in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The first chapter of this real-life drama closed with him walking through the cars one more time as the sun set. The golden light reflecting off polished metal. In that moment, he knew that the battle had only just begun. But he also knew that patience, preparation, and calm observation would be his greatest allies in the challenge ahead. The tension in the neighborhood has been growing for weeks. Whispers, rumors, and curious glances followed the man wherever he went. People had started to talk openly about the cars he kept in the storage areas and garages. Some thought they were abandoned. Some believed they were part of a secret collection that he shouldn't even have. The more people speculated, the bolder some became. They seemed to believe that the vehicles were easy targets, something to be taken if only they acted quickly. Yet the man remained calm. He moved quietly among his collection, inspecting every vehicle with care. Adjusting mirrors, checking oil levels, cleaning every speck of dust, and making sure each car was in perfect condition. The harassment had shifted from subtle to direct. Letters turned into visits. Visits turned into demands. A small group of people began showing up regularly, talking loudly and trying to intimidate him. They would say things like, "You don't really own these cars, do you?" Or "They are going to take these vehicles away if you don't act." Some even went as far as leaving notes on car windows claiming the vehicles were being reported as abandoned and could be towed at any moment. The man read each message, took careful notes, and then set them aside. He never responded immediately. He understood that reacting too quickly could give them the advantage, and he had no intention of letting that happen. Each morning, he would wake up, make himself a cup of coffee, and walk slowly through the rows of cars. He had his favorite route, a path that allowed him to see every car's condition at a glance. Sometimes he would pause for a few moments to run his hands gently over the paint or open the hood to check the engine. It was his way of staying grounded. No matter what chaos existed outside, he had control over his collection. This quiet routine gave him strength. It reminded him why he had spent years acquiring these vehicles, often quietly and with discretion. His calmness frustrated those who tried to intimidate him. The more they tried to pressure him, the more composed he appeared. They didn't understand that his composure was not indifference. It was a calculated response born from years of experience and observation. He had learned early on that impatience and rash decisions almost always led to mistakes. He watched and waited, letting them reveal their intentions without interference. Every visit they made, every word they spoke, was recorded and stored in his mind. Details mattered, and he knew that, eventually, these details would be his advantage. One afternoon, a group of men arrived, claiming they had the authority to take some of the cars away. They were confident, loud, and aggressive. One of them even said, "These cars don't belong to you. You should step aside before this gets messy." The man remained silent at first, letting them finish speaking. When they paused, he calmly asked for their identification. The official paperwork for the cars, and legal documentation proving their authority, they were unable to provide any. He simply smiled and said, "These cars are legally mine, and you have no right to touch them." They were angry and frustrated, but without proper documentation, there was nothing they could do. They left, muttering under their breath. Clearly shaken by his composure and the clarity of his claim, despite this small victory, the pressure did not decrease. It only grew more persistent. Notices continued to arrive, some official, some clearly fabricated. People began to gossip more loudly, convinced that they were on the verge of exposing some wrongdoing. Neighbors who had once been friendly became cautious, whispering to each other when he passed by. Some even avoided him, afraid of being associated with someone under scrutiny. He noticed all of this, but chose to focus only on what he could control: the cars, their maintenance, and the careful documentation of every incident. He began to anticipate their moves. He would notice unfamiliar cars parked near the storage facility, unfamiliar faces observing him, and unusual timing in their visits. It was as if the people trying to challenge him thought they could overwhelm him by sheer persistence. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing that every action they took revealed more about their weaknesses than his own. He had seen this behavior before. People often assumed that silence was weakness, not realizing that the person remaining quiet might actually be gathering all the information they needed to respond effectively. During this time, he also strengthened his own defenses. Cameras were installed discreetly, locks were checked and reinforced, and every vehicle was insured and documented meticulously. He knew that when the moment came, he would need indisputable proof that the cars were legally his. He also reached out quietly to a lawyer, someone who specialized in property and vehicle rights, to ensure that he was prepared for any official challenge. Every precaution he took was careful and deliberate, aimed at protecting his collection without alerting those trying to provoke him. Despite the tension, he continued his daily routines. Early mornings were spent checking engines, polishing surfaces, and adjusting the interiors. Afternoons were for organizing documents, reviewing legal paperwork, and noting any unusual activity. He found peace in these tasks. The cars were not just machines. They represented years of hard work, careful planning, and a deep personal connection. Maintaining them was as much about preserving his own sense of order and control as it was about the vehicles themselves. One morning, a new development occurred. A man who had been particularly vocal and aggressive showed up at the storage facility, insisting that he had the authority to have one of the cars towed. The man calmly asked for proof. When none was provided, he explained the legal status of the vehicles, presenting carefully organized documents showing ownership, insurance, and registration. The aggressor's confidence faltered, and for the first time, it became clear that their efforts were not succeeding. The confrontation ended without violence, but it sent a message to everyone involved. The quiet man was not to be underestimated, even as he dealt with these challenges. The man noticed changes in the neighborhood's behavior. Some neighbors began to distance themselves from the people causing trouble, sensing the tension and instability. Others whispered about the audacity of trying to seize property that clearly belonged to someone else. The man observed silently, noting every interaction, every glance, and every conversation. Each piece of information was valuable, building a mental map of who could be trusted, who could not, and how to respond to future threats. As the days went on, the pressure continued to build. Notices arrived more frequently, strangers appeared more often, and the rumors of auction and legal battles grew louder. Yet through it all, he remained composed. He understood that the key to success was patience. The people trying to intimidate him were acting on assumptions, mistakes, and impatience. He, on the other hand, was acting on facts, preparation, and careful observation. The balance of power was quietly shifting. Even if no one else realized it yet, the man also began to recognize the psychological toll the situation was taking on those around him. Some of the aggressors were beginning to argue among themselves, their overconfidence turning into frustration. They underestimated his patience, thinking that silence and composure were signs of fear. Instead, these were deliberate tactics, designed to let the aggressors reveal their true intentions and weaknesses. Every misstep they made was being noted, every inconsistency recorded. One afternoon, while walking through the rows of cars, he noticed something unusual. A small group of people, not directly involved in the earlier confrontations, had gathered near one of the storage facilities. They were observing, whispering, and taking notes. He realized that the attention was expanding beyond the original aggressors. More people were becoming curious, and the stories were spreading faster than he anticipated. This could be a problem, but it could also be an opportunity. The more people watched, the more likely it was that the truth, when revealed, would be undeniable. He decided to take a subtle but important step. He began documenting not just the cars and the interactions, but also the behaviors and movements of those trying to intimidate him. Every visit, every note, every whispered rumor was now recorded meticulously. Photos were taken when appropriate, dates and times were logged, and all observations were stored securely. He knew that when the moment came to assert his ownership and protect his collection, having a detailed record of events would be invaluable. Meanwhile, the man's personal routines continued to provide him with a sense of normalcy. He prepared meals, spent quiet evenings reviewing documents, and occasionally took short drives in some of the cars to ensure they remained in excellent condition. These small moments of normalcy reminded him that, despite the growing tension, he still had control over certain aspects of his life. Maintaining this balance was crucial. It prevented the situation from overwhelming him and ensured that he could respond effectively when the time was right. One particularly tense day, confrontation almost escalated beyond words. An individual attempted to block access to one of the garages, claiming it was public property and that the man had no right to park there. The man calmly approached, asked for legal documentation, and presented his own, carefully organized, an undeniable proof of ownership. The aggressor's tone shifted from confidence to uncertainty as it became clear that the quiet man was prepared for every challenge. The confrontation ended without further escalation, but it served as a reminder that vigilance and preparation were essential. By the end of Part 2, the situation had reached a critical point. The man had endured weeks of harassment, intimidation, and rumors, yet he remained calm, composed, and meticulously prepared. His daily routines, careful documentation, and patient observation had given him an advantage that his aggressors could not yet see. They believed they were close to forcing him to act or give in, but in reality, the man had been quietly building a foundation that would soon make their efforts irrelevant. The neighborhood weeks had passed since the man first noticed the increased attention around his cars. The whispers, rumors, and occasional confrontations had not lessened. If anything, they had intensified. The people who had tried to intimidate him were now becoming more desperate. They believed that their persistence would eventually pay off, that eventually he would make a mistake, or that the collection could be claimed through legal technicalities. But they were wrong. The man had been preparing quietly for this moment. His patience, careful observation, and meticulous documentation were all coming together now, ready to reveal the truth that had been hidden for so long. One morning, he received a notice that seemed more serious than the previous ones. It was official-looking, claiming that some of the cars might be subject to removal due to alleged ownership disputes. Most people would have panicked, but he did not. Instead, he reviewed the notice carefully, noting every detail. He compared it with his own records, cross-referencing registration documents, insurance papers, and ownership certificates. Each car had its proof neatly organized, and he knew exactly which documents were needed to counter every claim. This was not a battle of strength or intimidation. It was a battle of facts, preparation, and law. The people who had been harassing him were unaware of the layers of protection he had put in place. Each car was registered under legal entities and trusts that he controlled, meaning that the vehicles were fully protected against claims. He had anticipated the possibility of disputes, knowing that when people grow desperate, they will attempt to manipulate rules or take advantage of perceived loopholes. His preparation now allowed him to respond swiftly, presenting undeniable evidence of ownership that left no room for argument as the day went on. He noticed a group of individuals lingering near the storage facility. They seemed to be plotting, discussing their next move, unaware that he could observe everything without them noticing. Cameras captured their presence, and he made mental notes of each person, their behavior, and the timing of their visits. This information would be useful later, not just for legal purposes, but also to understand the mindset of those trying to challenge him. He had learned that observing people often revealed more than any confrontation could. The man then took a proactive step. He contacted his lawyer, explaining the situation and providing all the documentation that would be needed if any legal challenge arose. The lawyer reviewed the papers carefully, confirming that everything was in order. This quiet preparation was crucial. It meant that when the time came to assert his ownership publicly, he would do so with absolute clarity and authority. There would be no doubts, no loopholes, no way for the challengers to manipulate the situation. Late that afternoon, one of the individuals who had been particularly aggressive tried to engage him directly. The man approached calmly, asking questions and making statements designed to provoke a reaction. But he remained composed. He answered politely, showing documents that clearly established ownership of the vehicles. The aggressor became frustrated, unable to challenge the facts presented. Slowly, the individual realized that his tactics were failing, that the quiet man was not just calm, but also prepared in every possible way. Frustration replaced arrogance, and the confrontation ended with the aggressor leaving. Muttering under his breath, the neighborhood began to notice the shift. People who had once whispered about auctions and disputes were now witnessing the man's careful and organized response. He moved among his cars, performing routine maintenance and inspections. while others watched and whispered, unsure of what to make of the situation. The truth was beginning to emerge subtly. It was clear that he was not just a passive collector. He was a meticulous strategist, someone who understood both the value of his cars and the importance of protecting them. Over the next few days, the man continued to document every interaction. Notes, photographs, and timestamps created a clear record of every attempt to challenge his ownership. Each detail mattered, and he left nothing to chance. Even small behaviors like lingering near a gate or watching him from a distance were recorded. This quiet vigilance ensured that when the time came to assert his rights, he would have a comprehensive record that left no room for misinterpretation or false claims. One morning, he decided to meet with a few trusted individuals who were aware of his collection and the legal protections in place. They discussed the escalating situation and brainstormed ways to ensure that the vehicles remained secure. It was a discreet gathering, focused entirely on strategy and preparation. They explored scenarios, potential challenges, and responses. Each plan was detailed, considering not just immediate threats, but also long-term implications. The man's calm demeanor and careful planning reassured everyone present. It was clear that he had the situation well in hand. Meanwhile, the people trying to challenge him became more erratic. Their attempts to intimidate or manipulate the situation were increasingly visible. They underestimated the man's ability to remain composed and prepared. They believed that constant pressure would eventually lead to a mistake. But the man's patience and methodical approach made him almost untouchable. Each failed attempt further exposed their lack of understanding, and slowly, doubt began to creep into their minds. Late one evening, the man walked through his collection, taking a moment to reflect. The cars glimmered under the lights, each one a testament to years of careful acquisition and dedication. He thought about the challenges he had faced and the patience required to overcome them. The tension in the neighborhood was still palpable, but he felt a sense of quiet confidence. The preparation and documentation he had put in place were like an invisible shield, protecting not just the vehicles, but also his peace of mind. The next morning, he received a visit from a local official who had been made aware of the situation. The official asked questions, examined the vehicles, and reviewed the documentation he provided. Everything was in order. The man answered calmly, presenting each document clearly and concisely. The official left satisfied, noting the thoroughness and legality of the ownership. This visit was a turning point. It demonstrated that the man's careful preparation and quiet vigilance were not just effective, but also undeniable. The truth of his ownership was now documented and confirmed by authority. As the days progressed, the aggressors began to realize that their efforts were failing. The man had been methodical, patient, and meticulous in his preparation. Every claim they had made was easily countered with documentation, and every attempt to intimidate was met with calm observation and strategic response. Their frustration grew, and some began to withdraw, realizing that their persistence would not yield the results they had hoped for. During this period, the man also made subtle improvements to his security measures. Cameras were added to blind spots, access points were reinforced, and additional documentation was organized and stored securely. These enhancements were not meant to intimidate, but to ensure that the collection remained protected against any future attempts. He understood that security was not just about preventing physical loss, but also about maintaining peace of mind and confidence in ownership. One afternoon, an unexpected visitor appeared. It was someone who had knowledge of the man's secret collection, but had not been involved in the confrontations. They offered advice, support, and insights that reinforced his strategy. Their guidance helped him see angles he had not considered and provided reassurance that his meticulous preparation was both necessary and effective. This support, though discreet, strengthened his confidence and further solidified his approach to protecting the cars. The man continued his routines, maintaining the vehicles and monitoring the neighborhood. Each day, he moved with purpose and calm, performing inspections, cleaning, and making minor adjustments as needed. These routines were more than maintenance. They were a way to stay focused and balanced amidst the growing tension. They reminded him of why he had built this collection in the first place, and reinforced the importance of patience, observation, and preparation. By the end of Part 3, the man's position had grown stronger. The truth of his ownership was documented, verified, and undeniable. The people who had tried to intimidate or manipulate the situation were increasingly aware that their efforts were failing. The neighborhood began to recognize the quiet man's meticulous planning and calm authority. The stage was now set for a more decisive moment. The hidden truth of his ownership, carefully protected and quietly maintained, was about to become clear to everyone, and those who had underestimated him were in for a surprising revelation. The quiet man had endured the pressure, remained patient, and prepared every detail meticulously. He was ready to reveal the full extent of his secret ownership, and the consequences for those who had tried to challenge him would be inevitable. The quiet man had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Ever since he realized that the people in the neighborhood who had tried to intimidate him were underestimating both his patience and his preparation. The situation had escalated to a point where the truth could no longer be contained. He had meticulously documented every interaction, every attempt to manipulate or challenge his ownership, and every small detail about the vehicles themselves. Now, it was time for the consequences of their assumptions and actions to unfold. It began with a small gathering. It's unexpected and unofficial. Some of the individuals who had been most aggressive came to the storage area, believing that they could force a reaction or find a way to claim at least one of the cars. They arrived with confidence, expecting compliance, perhaps hoping for a confrontation they could manipulate to their advantage. What they found instead was calm and meticulous organization. The man welcomed them politely, but his demeanor was firm, unwavering. He presented documents, registrations, insurance papers, and legal proofs of ownership. Each sheet was carefully organized, each signature verified, and each detail undeniable. Their faces shifted from confidence to confusion, then frustration. They had thought the vehicles were abandoned, thought the man was vulnerable, thought he could be bullied into surrendering them. Instead, every step they had taken to assert authority or intimidate him was met with clear evidence that they were wrong. The man did not raise his voice, did not argue, and did not even need to escalate the confrontation. The truth was self-evident. As he calmly presented the documents one by one, the group began to grasp the reality that their actions had been misguided and reckless. Some of them tried to argue, to challenge the documents, to cast doubt, but the quiet man had anticipated every possible question, every possible claim. He responded with precise information, calmly, without emotion, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. The aggressors realized that not only were they in the wrong, but they had exposed themselves to potential legal consequences. Their arrogance and impatience had led them to make assumptions that could no longer be defended. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. Neighbors who had been watching from a distance were surprised to see how calmly and effectively the man had handled the situation. Whispers turned to murmurs of admiration. People began to understand that the quiet man was not just a collector of cars. He was someone who had prepared for every eventuality and understood the importance of patience, observation, and meticulous organization. His composure had transformed from a source of frustration for the aggressors into a clear demonstration of authority and confidence. Consequences for the individuals who had tried to intimidate him became more tangible over the following days. Some faced minor legal challenges due to false claims or harassment. Others were publicly embarrassed when it became known that their attempts to seize property were baseless. The quiet man did not seek revenge. He simply allowed the truth and the law to correct the situation. His strategy had been to protect his vehicles and assert his ownership, not to punish those who had been misguided. Yet the natural result of their actions was that they now faced the consequences of their own choices. Meanwhile, the man continued his daily routines, performing the same careful maintenance and inspections on each vehicle. These routines had not changed, but the environment had. The tension that had once hung over the storage area was slowly lifting. Neighbors and passersby now understood that the man's ownership was legitimate and well documented. The whispers of auctions and seized cars began to fade. Observers who had once doubted or speculated now realized that the quiet man's patience and preparation had won the day. The man also took time to review his documentation, ensuring that every record was complete and up to date. He knew that maintaining clarity and accuracy was essential, even after the confrontation. This diligence reinforced the stability of his ownership and ensured that future challenges would be met with the same calm authority. His approach had always been about long-term security rather than short-term victory, and this philosophy continued to guide his actions. Over the next several days, the aggressors withdrew from the area. Some avoided contact entirely, embarrassed by their failed attempts. Others tried to justify their actions to themselves, but the evidence was clear and undeniable. The man's careful preparation, patience, and quiet authority had rendered their efforts ineffective. This withdrawal was not the result of confrontation or force, but of a steady and methodical approach that allowed the truth to emerge naturally. During this period, the man also strengthened relationships with neighbors who had been observing. He spoke politely and shared general knowledge about the importance of careful documentation, maintenance, and legal ownership. He did not boast, and he did not seek attention. His goal was simply to ensure that his vehicles were respected and understood as his own. The community began to see him not just as a collector, but as a person who valued careful preparation, responsibility, and integrity. Late one evening, the man took a walk through the storage area, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The vehicles gleamed under the soft light, each one a testament to years of careful acquisition and attention. He thought about the people who had tried to challenge him and the lessons that patience, preparation, and calm observation had provided. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction in knowing that the vehicles were secure, that the truth had been revealed, and that the community now recognized his careful stewardship. In the days that followed, the man made a few subtle improvements to the storage facilities. Cameras were adjusted for optimal coverage, access points reinforced, and documents organized in an easily retrievable manner. These steps were not taken out of fear or distrust, but out of a commitment to maintaining long-term security and peace of mind. He understood that vigilance was not about paranoia, but about responsibility and foresight. Some of the individuals who had previously been aggressive attempted to return. Hoping to find an opportunity they had missed, they were met with polite firmness, and their attempts quickly fizzled. They had learned, often through embarrassment or minor legal consequences, that the quiet man's collection was untouchable, not through force, but through preparation, knowledge, and calm authority. Each failed attempt reinforced the understanding that patience, observation, and strategy were far more powerful than aggression and arrogance. Meanwhile, neighbors and community members began to show subtle signs of respect and curiosity. They asked questions about car maintenance, preservation, and ownership. The man answered generously, but without revealing unnecessary details. He understood the balance between sharing knowledge and protecting privacy. His quiet authority now extended beyond the vehicles themselves, influencing the perception and understanding of those around him. Over time, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from tension to cautious respect. The aggressive individuals had retreated, leaving the quiet man to continue his routines without interference. The vehicles remained secure, the documentation intact, and the community aware of the legitimacy of his ownership. The man continued to perform routine inspections, maintenance, and minor adjustments, finding satisfaction in the continued preservation of his collection. By the end of Part 4, the story had reached a point of clear resolution regarding the conflict with the aggressors. The quiet man had maintained control through patience, meticulous preparation, and calm authority. Those who had attempted to challenge him had faced the natural consequences of their actions: frustration, embarrassment, and in some cases, minor legal repercussions. The community had witnessed the effectiveness of his approach and began to recognize the value of careful planning, documentation, and restraint. The man's victory was quiet but undeniable. He had not needed to escalate conflict, raise his voice, or seek revenge. Instead, he had relied on preparation, observation, and integrity. The vehicles remained his, protected and preserved, and the lessons for those who had underestimated him were clear. Patience, strategy, and calm authority had triumphed over aggression, assumptions, and impatience. The stage was now set for the final part of the story, where the ultimate confirmation of his careful planning and quiet strength would be fully revealed, leaving no doubt about the security and legitimacy of his ownership. The quiet man had reached a point where patience and preparation had become his strongest allies. The weeks of careful observation, meticulous documentation, calm responses to attempts at intimidation had all led to this moment. The neighborhood now knew that his collection was untouchable. But there was one final step to ensure that the vehicles remained secure, respected, and understood for the extraordinary effort and dedication that had gone into protecting them. He began by reviewing every detail one last time. Each car's registration, insurance papers, and ownership documents were double-checked. Minor discrepancies were corrected, and everything was organized systematically. He wanted to be absolutely certain that no challenge could arise, and that any questions from neighbors, officials, or curious visitors could be answered with clarity and confidence. This final preparation was not out of fear, but out of a commitment to excellence and responsibility. He understood that the work of protection was never truly complete, unless every detail had been considered and accounted for. Over the following days, he continued his routines, walking through the rows of cars, checking engines, polishing surfaces, and ensuring that every detail of the collection remained perfect. It was not just about maintenance. It was about preserving the value, both material and personal, of the vehicles. Each movement he made was deliberate, a reflection of the years of care and the lessons he had learned about patience, observation, and preparation. Word of his thoroughness and calm authority continued to spread through the neighborhood. People who had once doubted him now approached with a sense of respect. They asked questions about the cars, about maintenance, and even about legal ownership. He answered patiently, sharing knowledge without arrogance, teaching without revealing unnecessary secrets. His calm, measured responses reinforced his quiet authority and demonstrated that his victory had been earned. Through careful planning, rather than confrontation, the people who had attempted to challenge him were now fully aware of their misjudgment. Some had faced minor legal consequences for false claims or harassment. Others had been publicly embarrassed when their attempts were revealed as baseless. The quiet man never sought revenge. He allowed the truth and the law to speak for themselves. This restraint highlighted his integrity and reinforced the lesson that preparation and calm observation were far more powerful than aggression and impatience. One morning, he decided to take a long drive in one of his cars. The engine purred beneath him, the tires gripping the road with perfect precision. As he drove, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The challenges, the tension, the whispers, and the confrontations had all tested his patience and resolve. But through it all, he had remained composed, relying on meticulous documentation and careful observation. The drive was a reminder of the reward for persistence and the satisfaction that comes from overcoming obstacles with intelligence rather than force. When he returned, he found a small group of neighbors gathered at the edge of the property. They had watched the drive and were curious, pressed by the vehicles and by the composure with which he had managed the situation. He greeted them politely, answering questions and sharing insights about the care and maintenance of the cars. The atmosphere was no longer tense. It was filled with curiosity, respect, and a growing admiration for the quiet man who had protected his collection so effectively.